Where does myth and history meet? Dr. John Knight Lundwall and I have a really good conversation talking about history and mythology, and he takes us through a PowerPoint presentation showing a lot of interesting things. Many archaeologists and historians thought a lot of characters never existed. Sometimes places never existed. And upon further investigation, we found some roots to some of these things that give us reason to believe there was a historical beginning or a root to the stories that we're reading today. Yeah, it may be completely mythologized, but does that mean that there was no history to it or a person at the basis? I don't know. Let me know what you guys think. Hope you enjoy the show. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button and the bell, and don't forget, comment down below and let us know what you think. If you want to join Myth Vision Podcast, you can go to our Patreon account and join us there as well. We are Myth Vision. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We have my brother, John Knight Lundwall, Dr. John Knight Lundwall. How you doing?
Doing great, Derek. It's good to see you again.
You too. I want our audience who hasn't seen the previous episodes that we've done together, and the one that went missing, I don't know how that happened.
Well, that's quite okay. It gives it more authenticity when you bury some stuff for 1,000 years or so.
Look, ladies and gentlemen, this is an inside joke. So, anyways, what is your expertise, if you don't mind?
Yeah, I have a doctorate in comparative myth and religious studies from Pacifica Graduate Institute out of California. So, my dissertation was on the mystery cults of the Greco-Roman world. But really it was an exploration of how cultic systems emerge out of oral societies from which we get the myths, the mythology. So my area of study is in oral societies and how they transmit their information. And of course, mythology is part of that. I mean, when you do a graduate study, Derek, 90% of what you read is what academics think, right? You should be reading source materials and all, and you do, but you are reading a lot of what academics think about what ancient mythology and history and is and how ancient religions emerged. My innovative take is I took all that I read out of years of graduate school and realized that they were missing two huge chunks, and all of them. And so part of that is orality studies. It's shocking that you would miss that in theories of myth. And then the other part was oral cosmology. I'm a project leader of an archaeoastronomy project in Utah. I have a team of researchers, and we are looking at the Fremont Indian, that's the Native Americans that inhabited present-day Utah, 1,000 years ago. We don't know, we know almost nothing about them. But they did leave behind some, artifacts, archaeological artifacts, and a ton of rock art. And I've shown on several different panels that the rock art has been carved in alignment with the sun as it moves across the sky through the year. And so there's a whole methodology behind some of this rock art as they analogize it to the seasons and to the sun. They probably analogized it to other things, the moon, certain stars, but that would be very difficult to prove without more context. So this is what I do. I do, I lecture and I give presentations. I'm an editor, and I do this archaeoastronomy project, and I hang out with my buddy Derek every once in a while.
No, you bring up something interesting. We've done previous shows. For those of you who are watching, go down in the description. When this video's done,
we did our previous video. You can see where he talks about the orality and the importance of that. We're going to be touching. I can guarantee you, you can't have John on the show and him not discuss this, because it's fascinating. You know, you talk about the idea of astrological stuff, okay? Then you talk about orality and how we went from a non-written type of people to writing. And I feel like the reason why people can see astrotheology, or people call it star myth stuff, is because they are taking oral traditions, or like you also emphasized, it's not just oral. A lot of this is also dance and ritual movement, kind of like the Indian who's chanting across the fire at night. You know, it's an interesting thing. There's significance to that, but they're writing a lot of this stuff down, and we see, like you said, there's not enough to boom, we hit the nail. Here's the case. We prove with all absolutes. But I see hints of it. I see like there's definitely something there. And I think that goes into all of them. The Greek myths, you know, obviously Greco-Roman, the Egyptian, you got to kind of, in my opinion, I could be wrong, John, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's 3 pyramids that line up that look quite like Orion's belt. And I mean, there's people who actually deny that. So I don't know where we're going tonight. I'm just here to follow you. I'm your student, and I want everyone watching.
We've got some fun tonight. Tonight, I'm going to talk about the intersections between ancient myth and history, and so how ancient oral societies were they concerned about history? You know, and what is history to an oral society, and how they encoded that in myth, and what kind of history you get out of oral societies. And it turns out, once you lay that groundwork, we're going to, rabbit trail into the Bible, as you would say, very often. But as you understand how ancient oral societies transmitted their information, many of the stories in the Bible, you start seeing it in a new way. And so, but I've noticed on your show you've got a lot of mythicists, a lot of people who are saying this can't be historical because it's mythological, and it turns out the issues are far more complex. And so I think we're going to have fun. We'll have fun, and we'll tiptoe through the oral tulips, and we'll see where we get.
Two things, ladies and gentlemen. If you're going to be initiates to this, you've got to have thick skin and be willing to travel. I like to be, I guess you'd say, like water. Bruce Lee's little saying, be like water, And so I try to travel wherever my guests go and allow them to give what they have to offer. I'm here to learn. I'm a student. I don't have all the answers. That's why you don't see me just put out videos with Derek Lambert teaching. I always bring people on. I love learning, and I hope my audience feels the same way, because I'm on a quest for trying to find the concrete. Look, I see enough myth to know it's there. Anyone who has eyes that aren't, I like to call it Kool-Aid drinking red, they're not told what to think that it's saying, can see the mythology. But can you find the history? And I think once you know the mythology's there, it's very complicated to know, where does theology cut off and where does history begin? And that's even today, we all wrestle with that. Even you probably wrestle with that, but still you believe it's there. And I'm here on this journey, and I'll shut up now. We can get on with the show, brother.
All right, Derek. I totally agree. Sometimes extracting, I am going to start my PowerPoint. Let's see now. How do I share the screen?
He can write books, but he cannot. I'm just, ladies and gentlemen.
Let's see.
All right, looks good.
You got it?
I got it.
All right. Look, a long time ago, Mircea Eliade, who is a great scholar in the history of religions, said clearly, we do not doubt the historicity of characters in epic poetry, but their history soon doesn't long resist the process of mythicization. That's his word. And so, in other words, there's all kinds of historical content in the poems of Homer, for example. And yet, by the time it gets to us, it's been mythologized. And so, you know, you said how you can see where the myths are, but sometimes it's very hard to pull the history out of it. That is very true, because it's easy to throw the needle into the haystack, but sometimes getting the needle back out of the haystack is impossible. And so, and that's a problem, and that's a problem we're going to face. Hey, so I'm going to start. Here we have myth and history, the oral world and the written word. If you've seen my presentations, I always PowerPoint them. And I thought tonight we'd just jump right in. So I am going to take you to Egypt. I was there last year. All these shots are mine. This is Luxor, the Temple of Karnak, and it's the the pylon gate entering the temple. And I really want to get some shots of it. The wall that you see there is actually completely carved with images and hieroglyphs. So here's a closer up shot. And now you can see behind the statue that the wall is entirely covered with writing and images. It's actually very hard to see. You're there during the day. It's almost invisible because the sun blanches it out. And so luckily, I went there a couple of times, and I got there in the early evening, and I was there for hours in the night, and they have lights shining up, and I did all these camera tricks to try to draw out the images that I could. So here's just a close-up. You can see that the walls are carved. So let me tell you what's on this temple, because it's going to lead us into our conversation tonight. This is another image, by the way, not at Karnak, but Abu Simbel that I took, and it's Ramses riding his chariot during the Battle of Kadesh. And it turns out what we're looking at here at the Temple of Karnak is an entire scene of Ramses II fighting the Hittites in the Battle of Kadesh. That is what they've carved on this pylon gate. So here's what we know about that battle. Let me get back to my screen. One, it was an actual battle that took place in history. In fact, it's probably the best historically recorded battle we've got. There's references to it throughout Egyptian writing and in the Near East. And so we know it happened. It happened around 1274 BCE. It was the Egyptians versus the Hittites. It was a massive chariot warfare. They estimate, if the texts are to be believed, between 5,000 and 6,000 chariots were involved from both sides. And it was fought near the city of Kadesh. This is northern Levant. And Ramses II led his forces into battle. What we know historically about it is it doesn't, it appears to have been a draw. There wasn't a decisive, the Egyptians taken over the Levant after the battle. But it was a tactical victory for the Egyptians. And what we get on the writing of the gate that we saw there at the Temple of Karnak is a really interesting narrative. So let's get to that. So because here we have a drawing of the figures on that pylon gate. So black and white drawing. And I've repeated it because on the left portion of the gate, you see Ramses here. Can you see my cursor? Yeah. You see Ramses here sitting on his throne. And here he is in his chariot, and he's leading his chariot battalion into battle against the Hittites. Well, right behind him in that same scene is Ramses again, except he's twice as big, and he's facing the other direction. He's got these priests, giving oblations and blessings. And so we have Ramses facing one direction as he charges into battle. We have Ramses twice the size facing the other direction, presumably receiving prayers and gifts to get ready to win the battle. And he goes into battle. Well, it turns out the text on the wall shows us that the battle doesn't go well for Ramses. According to what is written on the wall, Ramses charges in, and as the sun sets and darkness falls, and his chariots are scattered, and he finds himself all alone, surrounded by the entire horde of his enemy, right? And so he gets on his knees and he prays to Ammon for aid to overcome his adversaries. And then at the darkest hour of the night, the 7th hour of the night, Ammon responds to his prayer. He's given power, and then he gets in his chariot. And in the next scene, which is on the right side of the gate, Ramses II gets into his chariot and single-handedly, this is without his army, he charges against the Hittites and he crushes them, right? Yeah. And so phalanx after phalanx, retreats in front of him. And at the rising of the sun, Ramses II is victorious. The Hittites are destroyed. And here we have this scene here where all their horses and chariots are in disarray. And there's Ramses on the right, bigger than life. And, the cavalry eventually comes in to mop up after he's done, right? So this is the scene we get. And of course, for the longest time, it was simply, reported by academics and scholars as just a radical piece of political propaganda, right? Ramses is showing that he is the God-man of Egypt. This is 13th century BCE, apparently contemporary with Moses, right? The same time period, and he supposedly is the same Pharaoh. And so, it's interpreted as he is just promoting himself as, the leader that overthrew the Hittite army. And so that's the way it was for a long time after these scenes were deciphered. But then in the early 1900s, a man by the name of Schwaller de Lubicz, who was a self-trained Egyptologist. By the way, all the early Egyptologists were self-trained. There was no school of Egyptology. They're all self-trained. Petrie and the whole lot of them are self-trained. And de Lubicz, French, incredibly intelligent, bright guy. And he lived in Egypt for 15 years. And he did an entire survey of the Temple of Karnak, and he realized that something was going on with this temple frieze in stone, and I think he had some very brilliant insights. So we're back here to the left side of the gate, and we have Pharaoh facing one direction, Pharaoh facing the other direction. So it turns out the smaller Pharaoh facing right is actually on that temple facing west. He's facing towards the setting sun. And he leads his chariot army at the setting of the sun. Okay? The bigger Pharaoh seated there, same person, is facing east. He's facing towards the rising of the sun. And he's receiving the power and blessings and prayers of the sun priests, right? So he's empowered at the rising of the sun to go into battle. Then he faces west and he goes into battle. And when the sun sets in the west, what happens? Well, it gets dark, right? And this entire battle scene gets dark. He finds himself totally overthrown, right? He's by himself. His ranks of chariots are scattered and gone. And at the darkest hour of the night, he is alone. And that's when he turns to Ammon and says his prayer. And at the darkest hour of the night just so happens to be the hour that the sun starts emerging out of the underworld in Egyptian mythology. And sure enough, after that prayer, he reascends with the sun by himself as the solar chariot to overthrow the Hittites. So what de Lubicz said is, wait a second, this entire historical narrative is being analogized with the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Because in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the neophyte descends into the underworld at death. And he goes through all these trials, and there's all these, all these opponents and all these things he has to overcome. And at the 7th hour, the darkest hour, he is or she is completely isolated. And must face um, must face the reality of who he or she really is in deity. It is the most treacherous point of the underworld journey for the dead. And if they can pass all the trials, if they can pass the darkest hour of the night, then the sun god sends them aid, and they begin reascending out of the underworld with the sun to obtain their eternal life in divinity. So the entire historical vignette that we see here on the temple gate, sure enough, it is a radical piece of propaganda. But at the same time, it's been analogized with the central religious mythos of the Egyptians, so that there's an internal logic that's occurring here, and that's really Ramses is following the role of the initiate as he descends into the underworld, dies, is reborn, and reascends out of the underworld for total victory. So what we have then is the connection, the confluence of myth and history. The Battle of Kadesh really happened. It's a completely historical event. Ramses II was a completely historical figure. But the history we get told on the temple wall can't be interpreted as, what actually happened, a blow-by-blow account. It's all been mythologized, but the mythologizing isn't arbitrary. It's not random, and it's not just propaganda. It is propaganda, but it's not just invented to promote Ramses II as if, I'm the greatest pharaoh in the world, right? Ancient version of Trump or something. But he is being analogized with the center cult system and cosmology of Egyptian religion. So literally, we get this vignette here where history is being mythologized, which is what people do in the 13th century BCE. Okay, and and this is the time of Moses, plus or minus a few centuries, historically speaking. This is what is done. So, and this is what is done from the foundations of Israel all the way until centuries later, we get literate priests, not mythologizing history, writing the Torah. But before that, the oral tradition, oral peoples mythologize history. Now, just think about it for a sec, Derek. For us, we create histories by thousands of footnotes, right? Good historians have journals and newspapers and biographies and books and sources and personal interviews, right? They've amassed all this information by which they compile a history. How much of that do oral peoples have, people without writing? And the answer is zero. None of it. They don't have any of that. Now, of course, the Egyptians are literate in the 13th century BCE, but it's a different kind of literacy. It's not the full literacy of, say, the classical Greeks. That is to say, they're using different alphabets, and they've got one foot still fully in the oral cult, and one foot in textual analysis. The medium is the message. And so it takes centuries after the invention of writing for a fully literate consciousness to emerge. And we start getting that in classical Greece. This is the difference between ancient Greeks and every other society. But as it turns out, oral peoples mythologize history. They can't collate thousands of footnotes with thousands of sources. They can't do that at all. What they do, therefore, and I really hate reading on podcasts, but I'm just going to read one paragraph.
Okay.
Just one. This is and this is self-serving. It's out of my own book. So forgive me.
Gotta get it.
You got to get it. But let me just read. In oral societies, real and historical details of a person or event last in the memory for about a century. A grandfather can tell a grandson about his experiences. The grandson eventually tells his grandson what he has learned. After that, the initial teachings of the first grandfather may degrade. To maintain historical continuity, persons or events that must be remembered are placed within a specific memory theater set up for them. Myth. Oral peoples have a set of narrative templates. These templates are products of their cult and cosmology. In other words, they are associated with the rituals and festivals that are constantly maintained and familiar to everyone. So myth just isn't random. It's just not arbitrary. They just don't invent stories. What happened there at the Temple of Karnak is the historical event was analogized with what everyone knew in the priesthood of the temple cult. The Book of the Dead, the journey of the dead in the underworld with the sun, right? That's what they analogized with it. So if you want to remember an event or a person, you are going to put them in to a narrative template that everyone knows. And that's going to be your cosmological cult system. In this case, that was the Book of the Dead and the journey of the dead in the underworld with the sun, okay? People of renown are placed within these templates and their stories are mythologized so that they can be remembered for generations. The process is reversible so that when a particular teaching must be transmitted, a myth is told rooted in historic fact. Eliade observes, the historical character of the person celebrated in epic poetry is not in question, but their historicity does not long resist the action of mythicization. Eliade reminds us that myth is not the first stage of the development of oral history, but the last. So by the time mythologies are produced, you're at the last stage of the historical process of the oral mind.
So trying to reverse that process, there's going to be some complications no matter who you are. Even if an oral, I'm going to go so far as to say, even if an oral person was trying to reverse the process from another culture, they still wouldn't pin down what probably really happened. There's no way to do it. And so in the literal sense, in the whole,
in the
I'm not going to say
sense.
some of it, right? I'm not saying some of it you can't pull out,
Right.
but we don't know always exactly where. And you're suggesting the literate people, the writers, the guys who came on with alphabets and fully known language that's being written, I'm not going to say every author who wrote this, they might have understood, hey, this is not literal, but definitely something happened over time. And it's not what we think of is not the way that it was meant to be understood. That's the best way I could put it without trying to pin down.
You're absolutely right. I couldn't have said it better. To reconstruct the history in myths is it's like interpreting rock art. It's nearly impossible. So there's only a few things. You know, when I look at rock art, I give the measurements. I show how the sun works with it. Right. I observe what I can prove, but actually interpreting it without any context is almost impossible. Look, even Derek, in classical Greece, right, in 5th, 4th century BCE Greece, the Greeks could not agree what Greek mythology meant. Okay, look, you had the humorists who believed it was historical, that the Greeks emerged from historical peoples who got mythologized and divinized. And so that's the whole school of people who believed that the myths were historical. Okay, so guess what? That's always been on the table. As far back as you go, if you were to go back and say, hey, was Orpheus real? Most people would tell you, of course he was real. And was Dionysus real? Was Heracles real? Yeah, of course he was real. But at the same time, you had other Greeks who said, no, it's the natural sciences. That's what myth represents. Other Greeks said, no, it deals with religious initiations. It's an allegory for initiation. And other Greeks said, no, it's just fable. It's just made up. Okay? They were having the same arguments 2,500 years ago that you're having on your show today.
That's awesome.
But now, listen, they're the Greeks, right? They're the ones that have transmitted this stuff to us. And by classical Greek times, it was already. Now, why was that the case? And that's because classical Greece emerges in most Greeks still were non-literate, but it is a fully literate system, and the fully literate scribes are the ones transmitting this to us. We're getting everything through their lens, and that's probably not the accurate lens to get it from. In fact, it's definitely not the accurate lens to get it from. And so, so we're just reading. 90% of the writing in Egypt comes from southern Egypt in the upper classes. So everything we read of all the Egyptian hieroglyphs and the myth systems and the ritual systems is just reflecting, a point of view of a small class of people. And so the bottom line is, it's difficult to put myth back together. It's Humpty Dumpty. Put myth back together.
Can I make a comment? This is this is my opinion right now. I have an opinion that's constantly evolving, literally by the day. I'm learning things by the day. I am absolutely open-minded. I am not a strict anything. In fact, I found myself more agnostic because I said it's probably better that I'll be safe and say I don't know based on all the stuff, because what we do have has been convoluted by church fathers and stuff. And I know I'm jumping ahead. I don't want to go there. I'm just making the point. I'm being careful, because the way I look at it is this. We used to not think that Troy existed. I mean, I remember when scholars thought that, and then we found it. We used to think the Philistine did not exist. Hold on. What happened? Well, guess what? I'm going to remain open-minded, even if I'm like, I don't know if there was, but I'm not going to be shut off to the idea that if evidence does come forward, I'm not going to say, hey, that actually sounds like there might have been a Hercules. Just saying. I don't know,
right.
But I don't think we'll be able to prove there was ever a Hercules based on what we found so far. But it's not bad to suppose there could have been. And like you said, it's blanketed in such mythology to know. Dr. Price likes to make the funny jab, and he goes, what was he, an ancient bodybuilder? And I mean, was the guy a strong man? I mean, they did make a story about it. Or was this a myth of the strength of the sun being superimposed on a person who might have just been a warrior or a fighter or a regular soldier who, you just never know, because could his strength have been just literally the strength of the sun being put onto a person? Therefore, there was no strong man necessarily. You know what I mean?
Just as a parenthetical, when it comes to Heracles, one, Heracles is not of Greek origin. Martin P. Nelson, The Mycenaean Origins of Greek Myth, that's a book, tracked motifs of the Heracles labors in the Mycenaean age. So Heracles was inherited by the Greeks, not created by the Greeks. Two, most of the labors of Heracles archaeologically is found on in the throne rooms of the kings of the city-states. So the kings took upon them the persona of Heracles as they sat in their throne, which means that the labors of Heracles, is basically imbuing the power of rule to the king of the city-state, which is interesting because several Greek historians tell us that Heracles comes from Egypt and that the first Egyptian king was Heracles. So again, it turns out the Epic of Gilgamesh and the labors of Heracles have so many things in common that what we're breaching is a common cult mythic system that was shared throughout the Near East, in Babylonia, in Egypt, in Greece, in Mycenaea, so Gilgamesh then is the Babylonian Heracles. Greek historians insist that it comes from Egypt, and the first Egyptian king was Heracles, and of course that's a Greek name. And then the entire series of labors comes from Mycenaea, and so this is pulling that needle out of the haystack. What is the real Heracles? And point two is that oral peoples have a completely different epistemology. They organize their history completely. You know, they can't tell you a real biography of a person. Everything has to be encoded in memorable form because it has to be passed down orally. The reason why mythologies are full of outrageous characters and gods copulating with everything that moves and huge monsters and heroes that are super strong, one of the reasons is it's easy to remember. You know, the more outrageous the scenario and the characters, the easier it is to remember. And so mythologies tend to be oversized, outsized, because that is a demand of orality. That's just a function of transmitting an oral process. But at the same time, you cannot transmit a biography of an individual. He quickly becomes, or she quickly becomes, mythologized into the oversized cosmic processes by which they encode all their information. Literate peoples, we encode our informations in books. They don't have books. They encode their information in nature and the cycles of nature. So what's happening in nature is sort of the spine of their stories, and then things are glumped onto that as far as history is concerned. But they do that, right? There's this intersection between myth and history and cosmology, and you know, and it is finding a needle in the haystack by the time we come to it, and very difficult to do. But I can tell you this: in Haiti, so you have Haitian mythology. This is the Caribbean, right? And Haitian mythology is composed of three sources. The native Haitians, which came from Mexico and Central America, they have all these war gods, Aztec and Mayan war gods. The African diaspora, so early 1500s, the first slave ships from Spain arrive in Haiti with African slaves, and they're there to process the sugar cane, because sugar is what drove the slave trade in those centuries. And then eventually the French show up and take over the island. But so you have this African, native Central American, and Christian influences all in Haitian myth. But what's interesting, I bring all this up is because one of the things the people of Haiti do is they worship the dead. They have an ancestor cult. And if there's a particular person who did a great thing for the village, they will memorialize that person. And every year they'll mention him and they'll bring him back to life. They even have rituals to draw him up from the underworld. This is the whole possession thing. This is the origin of our zombie, by the way. The Walking Dead, it emerges from this myth cult system.
Take notes.
Yeah, and so, but over generations, you just can't remember the specific person. And so the person turns into an archetype. They turn that person into a Loa, a Haitian deity. And so the Loa then kind of expands and incorporates the biography of the person that they were trying to remember. And soon enough, the person is forgotten, but the Loa is remembered. But the Loa now has an attribute that came from the actual historical person. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so this is how it happens in Haiti. It's how it happens in oral societies. And so you get these deities or these heroes such as Heracles. And I'm not going to go around and say Heracles is historical.
Right. No, I understand.
That's not what I'm saying.
You're not closed off to there having been an original basis for why the archetype developed to be. That's what I'm saying. There could be a core, and it's not dumb in any way to think there's a foundational reason for, I'll just give you one example, jumping to Jesus, and why I think this is important. Someone mentioned recently.
Oh, we'll talk about Jesus.
Okay, so then I don't want to steal any thunder.
No, still.
Okay, shoot your thunder, Zeus. I honestly can't. I honestly can't steal your thunder. Your thunder's too. You're so far above me. No, I'm just kidding. No, but Camille Gregor recently came on. He's a historicist, and he said, based on if you're going to do prior probability, like Dr. Richard Carrier, who's a mythicist, he said you wouldn't create, not saying there haven't been scenarios like the cargo cults, which are brought up by Dr. Carrier about how it didn't take long for them to develop a mythical character. But according to the idea of Jesus's historicity, they wouldn't have created even a historical fictional biography of a guy 40 years ago. It's just too soon. Now, if he was like slamming a guy 400 years ago, it's more probable that this could be based off of an archetype that could have possibly at some point in the past been based off someone else. But the idea that Jesus himself, and I'm open to this, I'm very open-minded to looking for the guy. I don't know if we'll ever find the guy, but nonetheless, he makes a point that in 40 years, 50 years, they're writing all this literature. And really, if you take Paul's dating back into the 50s, like very soon. So you have to ask, was he, like you just described, as a very important player? And whether one wants to believe in the miraculous claim of the resurrection, which I myself am not, I'm not convinced of that. At the same time, if what you're saying about this whole thing is true, this could have been a very good person who taught very deep things to a very firm, strict followers of a small group. And they brought him back, so to speak, if you will. And they let him live through them, if you will. And I don't know if this is a combination. I mentioned this to someone else. I'm probably fringed by just throwing this out there. Even though I don't believe this, I'm just throwing it out there that the Romans were ancestral worshipers as well. It makes me wonder, with the influence of the Roman Empire on this mystery cult type group, if there could have been some type of element that was borrowed there. And it's not strictly Judaism, but it's something that's saying we really want to honor and keep this man in our we're going to let him live through us, so to speak. So I don't know, throwing it out there.
No, that's right. You're pulling at the needle in the haystack there. We're going to get into this. It is very hard to fabricate a brand new world religion without historical basis. I don't think that happened. So
right.
Hopefully we don't lose half your audience, but I'm not a mythicist.
That's okay.
I don't agree with this. The problem I have with Richard Carrier is not so much that he gets Jesus wrong, as that he gets myth wrong. In that just because something is mythology doesn't mean it's not history. This is the whole point I'm making, is that there will be, in oral cult systems, a person that is in mythology is really a title. Like every deceased in Egypt became an Osiris, right? Osiris is the god of the dead, but every deceased who's buried with the Book of the Dead or buried in a coffin with a coffin text is renamed Osiris, right? And of course, one of the etymologies, by the way, of Christus, is K-R-S-P. Those are the consonants in the Egyptian. They didn't write with vowels, and it meant corpse. It's where we get the word corpse, but it's also where we get the word corps, as in Marine Corps. And a Marine Corps is an initiated body, right? And so an Egyptian corpse is an initiated body. Initiated to what? Initiated for eternal life. And so the whole point here is that you can argue whether Christ is historical or non-historical, but one thing's for certain: when you're baptized, you're to become a Christ, right? You take on the name, you take on the identity. When the Greek king sat in his throne, he became Heracles. That was the point. So if you walked up and said, do you believe Heracles was historical? Was he really real? He'd look at you like, yeah, look at me. Yes.
Right.
So, I mean, we don't think that way, but you take on the role. That's right. How oral peoples also do it.
I might have to set you up with a discussion or a debate at some point on myth with Dr. Carrier, because he usually will challenge PhDs, if anything. But maybe there will be an interesting topic you can agree to debate over. Not necessarily the historicity of Jesus, but myth itself. and maybe, I don't know, something in that area. I'm not trying to
No,
run.
I'd be totally fine with that.
It'd be wonderful.
Yeah, no, it'd be totally fine. I just don't go as far as he goes,
Right.
which is to say there cannot be a historical Jesus. I personally think it's almost impossible to start a religion without a historical person to put it on.
I
Now, there's
think
all kinds of
I was-
mythologizing that we just looked at it.
Yeah.
The Battle of Kadesh in Ramses II. It's a historical vignette that is mythologized. And so we'll get into other examples as we get along.
I do want to say for the record, just so he may pay attention to this video. I want to say for the record, he doesn't say as a matter of fact that Jesus didn't exist. In his book on the historicity, he says there's a 1/3 chance. So it's based off probability. He thinks that there's a third chance, like it's not as probable that he was historical, and he uses the rank Raglan idea. So he says there's like a bunch of other epic heroes that some are already, like, I guess you'd say on record, most will say did not exist.
Right.
And then others did, and he tries to compare them based on probability. So it's a big probability. He never says as a matter of fact. Now, some people who are mythicists, they are absolutely convinced, and they don't even entertain. It's just he entertains. He says he entertains. I'm not.
Thank you for correcting me. I don't want to.
Yeah, no. I know
what he says.
But if it ever happens, you want to read his book. Trust me, because then you can at least know what you're talking to him.
Well, I should read his. I've seen him debate, and I've seen him on your show. Actually,
Yes,
I watched that. So, I just there's this kind of brand of mythicism where Jesus is not historical, and I'm a historical minimalist in the sense that you can't take everything in the Bible at face value. There's no newspaper editor walking around following Jesus, writing down every word he says. That just didn't exist, right? And so how does the text come to be? Well, this is what I'm going to be talking about tonight. How does myth and history develop into text? And so
I'm here for the ride, brother.
In fact, here we are. So look, there's three huge areas of interest when we get a text. How did the text get transmitted, right? How did we get it in our language? So how did it get translated? Where did it come from? How did it get to point A to point B? That's transmission. And how did it get into the language we're reading, right? That's translation, transmission, translation. And it turns out all of that, in fact, affects interpretation. Or we just ignore transmission and translation. We reinterpret how we want to reinterpret it, and then there we have it. Well, this is what's happened with most modern texts. It's not just the Bible. We've dropped transmission and translation altogether, and we just Christians have reinterpreted it. But guess what? That's been going on for centuries, and Muslims have been doing that with the Quran, and Hindus have been doing that with the Vedas, right? And so every generation reinterprets their text. And after a while, you lose how the text gets transmitted. You lose the process of the translation. Well, in biblical studies, we have a really interesting problem. And that is Bible scholarship begins with the assumption that the Bible began with fully literate scribes writing fully literate history. That's how Bible scholarship, Bible studies begins. This is a grand error. And so, of course, as time goes on, scholars get more critical, and they say, now, wait a second. We can no longer assume our a priori assumptions. But mind you, you know about the documentary hypothesis, right? The four different sources in the Old Testament, the Yahwehists, the priestly, the Deuteronomists, the Elohim, right?
You agree with it, right?
You're right. There's four different, well, I agree with it to a point. The problem with that interpretation is it again assumes that everyone's literate. This is all working within, that somehow the writers of the Bible, including the documentary hypothesis writers, all had libraries and books around them, and they were all literate, and they were all trading back and forth with text and comparing text. Turns out that
may have happened in pockets of civilization. In fact, that, you know, one of the theories is that, you know, Solomon is the wise king. Solomon the wise, right? He has a tradition of being the wise king going back to early Judaism. But if you read the Bible, he's a terrible king. I mean, he has like one episode where he saves a baby from two mothers arguing over it. And this is what, you know, Christians say, this is why he's a wise king. But if you get past that chapter, everything else he does is cats and dogs living together.
You forgot to mention another positive thing about the guy. He had 1,000 wives. I mean, come on, man.
That's right. David falls because, you know, he sleeps with Bathsheba, and of course he murders her. Well, he makes sure her husband gets killed. And then a whole platoon of soldiers he makes sure dies to hide his sin, right? So he goes from, you know, from adultery to murder and then mass murder. So that's, you know, but so Solomon solves this by saying, well, I'm just getting rid of adultery. Right? I've got is it 300 wives and 600 concubines or whatever it is, but
Crazy.
But what he does is he's the first big city builder.
Did he write the first Kama Sutra too? No, I'm just kidding.
I actually have been to Khajuraho, India. They have a whole temple dedicated to the Kama Sutra.
Ooh.
There's you know, sex scenes all over the exterior. I've got, you know, this is why I got into mythology.
Right,
right.
right.
What was I saying?
You're talking about Solomon, and I know I'm joking.
Oh yeah. So Solomon is the first king that is, you know, the big city builder. And in those days, to get notoriety and fame amongst the other city states, you built a court, you built a palace, and you built a library, and you collected all the traditions and all the scrolls from the surrounding area. This is why Solomon is probably the wise king. He builds a library. It may be, I mean, this is speculative, but this is probably the beginnings of the writing of the Torah, where they start collecting the traditions of the Israelite nation, right? So that's one of the theories. I think it's a good theory because, you know, technically, if you read the Bible, Solomon is not a wise king. He sets up the kingdom for a fall, and of course, his sons completely decimate the kingdom, and so, you know, the kingdom of Israel lasts 2 generations, David and Solomon, and then it's cooked. And so it's, and neither of them were good kings. That doesn't mean they weren't morally good kings. They were competent. You know, David overthrew the Philistines, I mean, according to the historical narrative. And so, you know, so one of the interesting things I like about the Bible, I mean, so there's, you know, a lot of critics of the Bible, Derek. The Bible canonizes its critics. Most people, if they wrote about their first king, would not put any bad information in it about the first king. The Jewish scribes said, David, here he is. He starts out, he's the perfect follower of Yahweh. He slays Goliath. He does everything right. He becomes the king. He is righteous. He is the perfect person. Then he becomes king, and he is god-awful. And they do not pull punches. He sleeps around, he murders, and he's god-awful, right? Most people wouldn't do that. Most people wouldn't do that. So there's all these critics who say, oh, the Bible, it's just full of, you know, it's ridiculous. And I would argue differently. I would say that's brilliant. That's brilliant. You are showing the shadow side of your own religion in your most sacred text. And that is what makes the Bible brilliant. And because it continually does that. It does not pull punches.
I got to ask, doesn't the Greek religion do the same? I mean, in some cases, they seem like the gods even do some things. They seem like they're not quite benevolent at times or whatever. You know what I mean?
Well, so look, there, you know, polytheists have a way to deal with the shadow side of their culture because they have different gods and goddesses. They have gods of light and they have gods of darkness, and they're always on at the altar, right? And so that's one way to deal with the shadow side of your culture. But then monotheism comes in, and pretty much you just focus on the light with a monotheistic God, and that's problematic. You also have to focus on the darkness, and the Jewish scribes did that in the writing of the Bible. In my view, Israel does not come off as great. It comes off as uh, a broken people, a broken culture, that they never get their act together. They're never following Yahweh, and as a result, it's a mess. It's a total mess from beginning to end. So, and quite frankly, I think that's a brilliant way. That's brilliant in my view, because that it keeps you humble. So anyway,
It does. No, I can dig it, and people will also argue. I've heard the argument of embarrassment to be used in this as evidence to kind of suggest, would you really fabricate all that? I mean, or would you not think there were probably some people who really did these acts and they're just laying it out there trying to be as honest as possible?
oh, there were people who did these acts,
Right.
because this is what people do.
Yeah, I mean, I think a
Right.
lot of the laws that are given, are there because people were doing the very thing the law is saying, do not do this. So, yeah.
Derek, history is a mess. Yeah, religion is a mess because it's historical. It's a mess. People are a mess. You and I are a mess.
I don't know, I'm just
Oh, well, I'm a mess. Maybe you've reached nirvana, personal nirvana, individuated, but I'm going to have a shot of whiskey when this podcast is done, just to get through. So, all right. So the bottom line is I have, 3 examples here: pyramid texts, Epic of Gilgamesh, the Bible. The pyramid texts, where do they come from? Right? Suddenly there are texts in pyramids. Before there was nothing, right? And so you get all these texts. The Pyramid of Unas is the first pyramid text, and it's a fully complete religious tradition. And it turns out that fully complete religious tradition appears like a thunderclap on the historical horizon from the first dynasty. What that tells us is the Egyptians didn't invent it, they inherited it. This stuff has been going back into prehistory, right? And so it all comes from oral tradition. Same with the Epic of Gilgamesh. And I've already said the Bible was supposed to be different. It wasn't supposed to originate in the oral tradition. In fact, most early Bible scholars said the Israelites had no mythology. They had history, right? That's just incorrect. If you're an oral society, and the Israelites were, you have mythology, because that's how oral mythology is simply the oral narrative you're passing down. Ritual is a somatic narrative which repeats the mythological narrative. Your temple cult is your hieratic narrative that repeats your ritual and your myth. And so they're all layers of each other, and this is how oral peoples transmit information. So we recognize that the pyramid texts are mythological. The Epic of Gilgamesh is mythological, but somehow the origin of the Bible is supposed to be different. But that just doesn't respect the religion of the Israelites, because the religion of the Israelites certainly exists in that same universe. So I thought we would just give some examples. I'm just going to go through and talk about some different texts from the ancient world and how different oral and literate processes get imbued upon them. And then we'll end by saying, okay, now that we see all of this in history, how can we reinterpret the formation of the Bible based off what we've just viewed? Okay. So, here I have these 2 little choral dancers. This is taken in Mexico. I think that might be Monte Alban. Many decades ago, Derek, scholars reading the Rig Veda, this is India's oldest religious text. It goes back 1500 BCE. And so this is the oldest stuff they got. Well, decades ago, scholars began noticing that a lot of the passages in the Rig Veda could not be understood reading it as if there was a sole scribe writing it. That there were multiple characters talking back and forth to each other, and they began realizing that what they were reading was actually a sort of play, a drama, and that these were characters speaking to each other, and that the text had to be read in the context of viewing it as being performed by two or more dramatic personae, two or more ritual actors who were performing the text. The text was an afterthought, right? Something else was going on. This was a performance. Okay, well, so they started to notice that in the Rig Veda, and then they realized, my goodness, most of the Egyptian funerary texts are written in this way. The Book of the Dead isn't a book, it's a ritual. And the Book of Breathings, which is a later funerary text, is very often is basically notes telling the priest what to say and do at the different stages of the ritual that they are performing as they're bringing the dead back to life. And so these texts are the text part of it is secondary. What the ritual that was being performed was the primary thing. And so now the question is, how do you understand a text where what you are reading is really just the cliff notes and the prop list? Because that's what it is. It's not like we're reading a full Shakespearean drama where all the lines and characters are fully laid out. In these ancient texts, the pyramid text, the Epic of Gilgamesh, what we are getting is the narrative footnotes and the prop notes. The main play never gets recorded. Okay, so then how do you interpret it? And it turns out you can't. I mean, so let's just cut to the chase. We really don't know what the pyramid texts are telling us. No Egyptologist can tell us, because the main part of it's all, the texts are basically epithets, mythological, cosmological epithets, mythological scenarios that are summarizing what the priests and the cult is actually doing. But the actual belief system doesn't get laid out in a literate process for us. Okay? So our earliest texts come to us as sort of disjointed, because the majority of what we want to know never gets written down. So now here's the thing. Hold on to your underwear.
Yeah.
Clement of Alexandria writes that of the Christian tradition, that the most sacred things of deity are not for writing, but only for speech. Okay? That's what he says. The most sacred things of deity are not for writing, only for speech. Now, if we take that literally, what he's telling us is there are aspects of the Christian tradition that could not be written down. And what aspects are they? The most sacred. The heart of it. That could not be written down.
I was going to say, this is beautiful, John, because I'll go so far, not only with the Christian, but the oldest or earliest we can find of Judaism, or not even Judaism.
Oh, absolutely.
Ancient
Absolutely.
Israel, because I talked to Dr. Bob, and I'm sure you're aware, I'm preaching to the choir with you, but I'm just saying it for our audience to remind them, because they've been following a lot of the shows. Dr. Bob talks about how a lot of these stories they weren't originally, they had to thread them together. They were not originally together. Like Genesis 1 and 2 did not originally belong, and they threaded these things. And to me, that's quite interesting. Like Lot, one can look at Lot and look at Noah and say, what a silly book. Because Lot is the last guy on earth. He literally ends up with his 2 daughters. Okay. Why didn't he just walk across the land to Abraham and take some girls over there? It didn't make sense, right? And Dr. Bob said, listen, they held on to these traditions because they were sacred to them. But Lot is the end, just like Noah is an end. And I actually threw out there, I want your thoughts, because you wrapped your head around some very old material. And what do you think about the proposition that Genesis 1 is another flood narrative? It's not what we've been told. It's literally the land drying up, the water is receding, the heavens and the birds in the air, all the animals are coming out again. It's a flood narrative. And what did you say about floods? The number one guy who's ever said anything about a flood narrative is you. That is where eternal life can be found. So there's something very interesting there about the flood narrative. And I wonder, do you think Genesis chapter 1 is doing that?
Well, absolutely. We could have a whole show on this.
We'll do another show sometime.
The ancient cosmology believed that the world was created, but oral peoples are cyclical thinkers, right? They're not linear thinkers because literacy changes that. Oral peoples are connected to the cycles of the sky. The seasons are cyclical, so all time is cyclical, right? So if there's a creation, there's going to be a destruction of the creation. So how does things get recreated? So you introduce the flood narrative as your recreation narrative. And so it turns out flood mythologies around the world are almost always associated with the creation stories of the culture, right? So that's just not Christian, that's worldwide. The flood myth and the creation myth. And again, let me just say the word myth doesn't exist in their vocabulary, these people who use them. That's our word. We're saying this is myth. And so it's a different category. Please know that for them back then, myth was reality. It was truth and reality. We say, no, it's not. History is truth and reality. Myth is something else. That's not the way they saw it. But the bottom line is, in the Bible, you have 3 stories that are rooted in ancient temple cosmology: the creation, the flood, which is destruction of water, and the fire, destruction of fire, which is the story of Lot. And if you go through the text, you will find parallelisms between the creation story, the flood story, and the story of Lot. So what it tells me is that originally, all 3 of those stories belong to an original corpus of oral tradition. And by the time the literate scribes write it down, they retain it, and they've retained the parallelisms that run through them. But of course, it gets historicized, right? We saw on the Temple of Karnak how history got mythologized. What the Jewish scribes are doing is they're historicizing the myth. So to your question, the creation story actually descends from this. It descends from ritual. The text we get is the prop notes. It's not what was really going on. If you compare Genesis 1 with Exodus chapter 40, which is the day of the new year of the Hebrew calendar, that's when they celebrated the creation. And what did they do? They set up the tabernacle in the wilderness. And how did they set it up? Each step coincided with the day of creation. So now you have to ask yourself, is the creation story a story about an actual creation of the world, or is it a story about the erection of the temple and the power of God in that society? Because now the context is different. It's now ritual. It's also cosmology. It happens on the new year, right? So
plus
the
it has
creation
a
story
structure to
is
it.
a ritual that has been turned into a text, and attached to that ritual was a flood narrative, which was turned into a text, and attached to that was a fire narrative, which became our story of Lot. And so we could go through all the parallels. That would take 2 hours, but they're there, yeah. And it's clear that those stories belong together in a single tradition. So a mythological tradition. Anyway, my point with this slide is that the earliest texts weren't texts. They were songs, dances, chants, choruses, and rituals. And when they get turned into texts, we lose the majority of what actually was going on, right? And so now now it's really hard to pull the needle out of the haystack, right? It just is. I mean, because we've lost the majority of the context. And if we take Clement at his word that the most sacred things of deity, we have to understand that in the ancient world, to oral peoples, the most sacred things you do not disclose. We are completely opposite. We, in the academic world, it's publish or perish. If you're not telling everyone what you know, you're no good. In the ancient world, it's the exact opposite. Publish and you will perish. If you tell people what you know, we'll kill you because it's sacred. It should only be disclosed to the people who can handle it. Now, you can go on and say, well, that's a way to control the population, a way to control. Yeah. But that's the way they treated sacred knowledge. Okay. And so the bottom line is, did that kind of attitude towards sacred knowledge exist in first century Christianity? According to Clement, it did. And we have other church fathers that also say that it did. And so if that's true, then something else was going on amongst the first century Christians, besides just, the gospel canons and the letters of Paul. There was a whole ritual tradition. That was the most sacred part of the religion that never gets recorded. Or maybe part of the narrative in the gospel is a narrative form of that ritual system that got historicized, right? We'll talk about that in a second, because that happens in the Old Testament. All right, here's another thing. Oral peoples can't memorize a phone book. They can memorize a lot, but they're not going to keep track of every personal pronoun that of all the people in their tribe, right? You quickly lose sight of that. And so if you are going to remember a person or historical event, what happens is the actual person's name quickly gets changed to a typological name. The name in the myth identifies the person's role in the story. Okay? And so we see this happen in the Bible all the time, right? Adam is the first person created from the earth, and his name means earth. He's named after the role he performs in the story. Enoch is, okay, so we only get a couple verses in the Old Testament of Enoch. If you go outside the canonized scripture, he's everywhere. In extra biblical tradition, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Enoch is mentioned more than anyone else except Isaiah. And so what that tells you is the Dead Sea community, Enoch was, besides Isaiah, the biggest guy in the tradition. Okay, so our Enoch literature, sadly, is very late, other than his mentions in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but the books of Enoch we have are very late. His name means initiate. And in every Enoch tradition that has survived, what is he? He is the person, he's the culture bearer, right? He's the Hermes Trismegistus. He's the Oannes. He's the Gilgamesh. He is the person who's initiated into the eternal world. He learns all the eternal order of things, and he teaches people writing, books, astronomy, mathematics, farming, all the arts. So his name actually fills the role of what he does in the narrative. As you go on down through the Bible, you find this all the time. And so, again, a lot of people say, "Oh, this is just silly." Obviously, this is mythology and it can't be historical. What I'm saying is, well, actually, this is what oral peoples do. If there's a person they want to remember, they quickly drop his name and they rename him based off what he did for them. Okay? And so
it's fair to say, I don't want to stop here. I just want to say, it's fair to say the person who actually existed in history may not be the name in the narrative.
Almost never.
Okay.
Right. So Abraham is the father of many nations, right? His name means father, right? And so, boy, that's a really good coincidence. These people keep naming their kids, based on what they do. Well, this is how you mythologize history. Okay. And so, again, Eliade says, we don't doubt the historical nature of the people in the epics, but quickly all their story becomes mythologized. It becomes, it gets changed into memorable form, right? people probably, you know, if people wanted to remember Derek Lambert, you know, after 1,000 years, your name would no longer be used. But whatever you did for the society, somewhere in the narrative, that would be told, along with a bunch of other stuff.
Trash man Lambert.
That's right.
No, I'm just kidding.
Along with a bunch of other stuff that you didn't do, because there's pieces from other people, and there's cosmological things, and there's religious things. And so again, you're pulling the needle out of the haystack. It's impossible to do, but these patterns exist. Okay, and so this is another thing that oral peoples do. And now we get into literate people. Okay, so we're not. So now, you know, they're using writing, but early literate people treat text differently than we treat them, and they treat history different than we treat history. Modern history, with all of our cited sources, is a modern invention of the past few centuries. That did not exist before that. So the compilers of the Bible, they were concerned with history, mind you, but they were encapsulating the history they were concerned with from oral tradition, which has already been mythologized. It's already happened, right? And so the rehistoricizing, but one of the things you find in the Bible is a chiasmus, which is a way that scribes wrote down their stories in parallel ideas. And so here we have the flood story out of the Bible. And if you go to here on the left, let me use my cursor, chapter 7 and 8 of Genesis, you'll find that, you know, Noah has to wait 7 days to enter the ark. There's a second mention of him waiting the 7 days. It rains for 40 days. The water's on the earth for a total of 150 days. God remembers Noah and says, okay, I better save him. There's a second mention that Noah waits for 150 days, another mention of the 40 days, and then he sends out the bird for 7 days and another waiting of 7 days. In other words, there is this parallelism that the scribes have used throughout the biblical text, mind you, as a way to organize the story. Now here's what's really, so I have this another example, which is a longer chiasmic structure of the entire flood story. So here's one of the things that the documentary hypothesis scholars did in the early days. They noticed this parallelism, and so they sourced the first half to one author and the second half to a second author, and they said they're splicing them together. Well, essentially that's wrong. This is actually a literate structure of these early texts. So, but what that tells us is they've dispatched with reporting history as only the facts as their primary concern. They're using different structures by which to record their stories, and this is one way in which they do that. And so the stories turn into these sort of parallels, mirror images of each other, and that's how the scribes remembered them, because most of these scribes, even though they're literate, actually are still chanting the stories. You know, have you heard the term library carol? You go to the library and they're the little desks that you sit in, and they're called library carols.
Yeah.
Yeah. The word carol means singing. And medieval monks literally sung the text they wrote as they wrote them. That's why it's called library carol. Okay. And so this kind of structure is the way these scribes approached the material, because it was the way they helped them organize it and remember it. So again, the primary structure of the text isn't on historicity. It's on how do you memorize it and record it. Right? Are you following?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And so
this is good.
So you get this kind of structure that exists not only in the Bible, but in various ancient texts around the world. And then you get something really interesting. Scholars in medieval texts. So this is centuries after, you know, the birth of Christianity. This is through the Middle Ages. Scholars are reading biographies of saints that have been compiled by medieval scribes, and they start noticing something. Saints that have similar names or the same name will have remarkably similar biographies. And then they start realizing, wait a second, these monks who are writing these histories of the saints are simply borrowing from one text to another. So if there's a Saint Bartholomew here and there's a different Saint Bartholomew here, they're saying, well, we know they're two different people, but they're both named Bartholomew, and therefore they must have been ordained by God to share the same roles. So I'll pull this from this narrative and I'm going to pop it right here because it's the same divine presence in both of them. Now, of course, we don't think that way, but this happens through the Middle Ages. And that the point I'm trying to make is that the monks in the Middle Ages treated text differently than we do. They treated history differently than we do. And it's not that they were lying or cheating or oh my gosh, I'm having a brain cloud. When you steal a text from another text, what do you call that?
You're talking about
plagiarizing.
Yeah.
Plagiarism didn't exist. There wasn't even a concept. It's simply how they treated text. They saw in history, if something happened to one person and that person was born into the same town or had the same name or similar things happened to from one person to another, they saw a connection and they would often sort of infuse the different stories across each other. And so they would put part of the story into this and part of that story into that. Well, again, we're pulling the needle out of the haystack. That's a mess, but that's how they treated text all the way through the Middle Ages. So again, this idea of the modern historicity, everything being a historical blow by blow, yeah, that is modern and that is recent. And then I've been reading Dennis McDonald recently. I really like his stuff. And you just did an interview with him a little while ago, Derek. Good for you. But he has a mimetic structures that he is arguing, and I think he does it brilliantly. What I can say is that is how ancient peoples would treat a text. They would take a well-known text that was considered to be great or sacred, and they would construct another text based off the structural spine of the text everyone knew. And that's all MacDonald is arguing. He argues, for example, that Euripides' Bacchae, the play, was the narrative structure that the writers of the Gospel of John used when they composed the Gospel of John. And so that there are these parallels between the two stories and texts that are really odd and strange, but his argument is they're just mimetically copying. Now, again, we would think, well, so none of this is history, but the historicity is another argument. What I'm saying is people in the ancient world treated text differently than we treat it. They treated history differently than we treat it. They treated it again. So our historical sensibilities have evolved over centuries and over time. And so we want to believe that everyone in the ancient past had the same sensibilities, and we're learning, nope, not even close. And it's not that they weren't concerned with history, they were. But again, history gets mythologized, history gets restructured, the stories get restructured, the stories get copied from one to another, things are changing all the time. And it's not, a conspiracy. And people aren't lying. Sometimes that happens. There's forgeries and there's all that sort of thing. But most of the time, this is just how information is transmitted in these semi-literate societies.
And then sometimes even these forgeries aren't. As much as Dr. Ehrman's wrote on this, about the forgeries in his book Forged. Sometimes they're doing it in not a deceitful way necessarily. They're writing in the name of someone that they follow, or they might have an honorable reason for why they forged. But I know that he wrote in his book that it was kind of frowned upon to do that kind of stuff. I don't know if it was in pockets that it was permitted, but maybe within the cult itself, it was okay to write in the name of or something, but it probably wasn't widely acceptable. I don't know.
Well, I agree. I agree with you, Derek.
in that, there are people writing forgeries to make money. So there's that motivation. But there are also people who will write a gospel for their community. And it's different from all the other gospels. And what have they've done? They've taken a mimetic structure from a core belief system that they have, and they've transferred it over to the Christian gospel narrative. And now they have a Christian gospel that they can believe in. Right? I mean, there is no fax machine or email in the ancient world. You have all these different Christian sects. Basically, every city was its own Christian church. We get the writings of Paul because it was a mess, right? He's writing to everyone saying, no, don't believe that. No, don't believe that. No, you got to do this, because everyone's on a different page, right? And there are all these different gospels. But here's my point, and that is this. Human beings, we're not really historical by nature. We continue to do this. It's interesting. There are two things that happen in social revolutions. You look at the 20th century, full of actually very dark, grim social revolutions. Communism, Russia, Nazism, Germany, totalitarian regime in Japan and in Italy. They did two things in all these societies. One, first thing they did was they rewrote the histories. So they wrote a new gospel. And so, are they lying? Well, they wrote the history based off their view of it, right? They create new enemies for the society to attack, and the history is written to provide a basis for the authority of the regime. Okay? So this is happening not in the religious world, it's happening in the non-religious world, right? The 20th century was the bloodiest century in history as far as we know, almost 200 million dead by the time you count all the wars. And most of this is from the shadow side of the pseudo-religious, non-religious. There's lots of arguments to be made here, but the bottom line is the first thing a totalitarian regime does when it wants to take power is it rewrites its history. It writes a new gospel. And that's just consistent. And so we're still doing this. And the second thing that the totalitarian regimes did is they got rid of the church. So I know you have a lot of critics of religion in the church on your channel. They either destroyed the church or they subsumed it. They walked in and said, you're going to do everything we tell you to do or we'll destroy you. And many of the churches said, okay. So, many of the Christian church became just a mouthpiece for the Nazi movement because they were given the choice, do this or die. So, and why did they do that? And that's because the church was the only thing that challenged the power of the state. These totalitarian people came in and said, we are the power. And the church said, well, actually, God's the power. And you answer to him. And they said, nope. That's not the way it's going to work. And so just as a reminder, all social systems have shadow sides. There is bad religion in every religion, every one. There's not bad religions. There's bad religion in every single religion. And there is good religion in every single religion. And I would argue this is, there's a bad way to do the state and there's a good way to do the state. And when the shadow takes over, then, the 20th century is an interesting lesson. The totalitarian regimes, they rewrote their histories and they got control of the church really quick. And then they did their things. So it's important to remember that. All right. And then as we exit out of this way that at least medieval people approached the biblical text, we have St. Thomas Aquinas in his great Summa Theologica. Right up front say, how do we interpret the Bible? This was a huge issue for him. And he said, well, the first thing you do is you do interpret it literally and historically. But that only gets you so far. And then after that, some of these stories have to be interpreted in other ways. morally, allegorically, and anagogically. So he lists it all out. And so for centuries, this is how Catholic priests were taught to teach biblical narratives. There was the literal or historical sense. There was the moral sense, which is the way most people do it today. The moral sense is the devotional sense. So, for example, if you're teaching the story of Abraham and Isaac, the literal sense is you would say, okay, Abraham really lived and he really had a son, Isaac, and God told him to sacrifice his son. And so he went out and built an altar and he was ready to sacrifice his son, and the angel stopped him. So that would be the literal approach. And then the moral approach would be something like, well, what do we learn morally from this story? And I guess the teaching would be obedient to God, and God will make sure that it works out for you, right? The angel will come and stop you. If maybe, there are all kinds of moral problems with that story. I mean, if God tells you to sacrifice your son, I think the first thing you should say is, no, God, I'm not going to do that. You do that. Right?
I mean, I've heard it as a reverse moral kind of story, that it was common to sacrifice humans in that time, and it was trying to kind of like slavery, right? We talk about that's how we use our morals from today and impose.
That's correct.
And that's not the approach. We did a show on that I just released. But what is interesting about it is, if you're going to take anything good from it, Israel at least changed their law and said, stop. We're not allowed to sell Israelites to Israelites. We're not even, there's no more of that going to happen.
That's correct.
So there's a moral lesson here trying to say, let's better ourselves and son. And maybe that's sacrificing your child is another one of saying, don't do
so this. That's one approach. And that is an approach that's quite common, is it's a story that stopped human sacrifice, which it appears to have, because the Israelites don't practice it that we know of after Abraham.
Right.
And so that could be, I actually heard a really interesting, a Jewish rabbi teach the story of Abraham.
Please tell me something new. I love it.
I loved his approach to it. And his approach was that Abraham failed the test of faith, that God expected Abraham to say, no, I'm not going to do that. If you want my son, you take him. I will not. So because Abraham in other places in the text argues with God, right? Abraham says, I'm going to destroy the city. And he says, no, don't do it. If there's 50 righteous people, don't destroy it. And God says, okay, if there's 50. And then Abraham realizes, well, there isn't 50. If there's 30, don't do it. He keeps arguing with God, and he tries to change God's mind. And both Abraham and Moses do this. And sometimes it appears they do change God's mind. So one of the interesting lessons, again, of biblical narrative is you can argue with God. You can disagree with God. And so this rabbi was simply saying, God expected Abraham to make the argument. I'm not going to do that. But Abraham doesn't. And that disappoints God. So he sends an angel. And mind you, after Abraham raises the knife over Isaac, God never speaks to Abraham again. He always sends an intermediary, an angel. Before that, it's God and Abraham. But after he tries to sacrifice Isaac, Abraham only talks to an angel.
Never thought about that.
So the argument therefore goes that Abraham fails the test of obedience, because what God was trying to teach Abraham was the moral conscience to stand up for the right, even against your own religious ethos. And so I thought that was a brilliant take on the story of Abraham. But again, that's a moral take.
Yeah.
And so it's a moral take. St. Thomas says another way to interpret Bible stories is allegorical. And so what do the Christians do with the story of Abraham and Isaac? Isaac is Christ. He's the forerunner of Christ. He's the sacrifice, the only son. And so they turn the story into the allegory of the Christian message. And so and then anagogical is the story is relating to the end times, the eternal realm, right? And so I don't know how you would teach. We are all Isaac on the altar of sacrifice, and we should be willing to sacrifice our own lives in order to inherit eternal life. So there are four different ways to interpret the biblical narrative that St. Thomas Aquinas talks about. And so you get, therefore, a wide variety of interpretations of different biblical stories using these lenses. Now, again, the literal sense is, the historical sense is presumed. I don't think most of these Catholic priests went around saying this didn't really happen historically. I think they did believe it happened historically. But, you know, a lot of the stories are hard to teach historically. And so they had these other frameworks to say, well, you know, I don't know, but here's the allegory of it, or here's the moral of it, or here's what we will know about heaven if we do this. And so, so they had these different ways of interpreting biblical stories. And then something happens. The Protestant Reformation happens. And what happens in the Protestant Reformation is a total rejection of Catholic authority, but also Catholic interpretation of Scripture, right? It's not just rejecting the Pope and his priests and his priesthood. It's rejecting the church and its rituals and its interpretations. And so after Luther, what starts to happen is more and more there is a very literal historical sense imbued upon the Bible narrative. And that is sort of, and that's because by the time Martin Luther comes around, everyone who's making the arguments are historicists. They're fully literate. The oral tradition has been completely forgotten. They're not even aware of it. We had to we remembered this as we started to find other texts and everything I've talked about before, the rituals and the chiasmus. This is all learning in the past century, right? When we've started to find these old things and say, hey, wait a second, there's more to this story, right? They didn't have any of that. And so the oral tradition was forgotten. The rituals were forgotten. They rejected the Catholic rituals anyway, and so we get really a strong historical interpretation of biblical story post-Protestant Reformation. And it's interesting.
Talking donkeys and talking snakes.
Right. Talking donkeys, talking snakes. It all becomes very literal. You know, the Protestant Reformation is the first social movement in history that uses the printing press for social reform. And, you know, the printing press is 15th century. You know, a century later, you get the Protestant Reformation, and you get hundreds of thousands of pamphlets flooding Europe promoting Luther and the Reformation. And quite frankly, the Catholic Church couldn't combat it. I mean, this was mainstream media, 16th century style, right? They had their priests teaching at the lectern in the cathedral, and suddenly everyone's got a pamphlet. You know, they couldn't combat it. And so it's just interesting how these print structures combine with the literate thinking, that the rejection of the old, everything gets reinterpreted largely as historical. So this is, you know, the beginning of, you know, and then in America you have the Great Awakening, and this eventually you get your fundamentalist Christian sects. And so there's a historical process by which people are taking biblical stories incredibly literal and historical. And it's a historical process, right? So how do we interpret the Bible? Well, we have to remember that in the beginning, for about 1,000 years, Israel had a oral temple tradition that was constructed around their myths, their rituals, their cosmology, and their temple. The creation story is a byproduct of that tradition. We get it as a fully historical, you know, scientific, you know, the creationists believe it's a blow-by-blow account of how God created the earth, that the earth is 7,000 years old. And
right.
It has nothing to do with that. This is a modern reinterpretation that has completely dropped all these things that are on your screen here. Many of the stories began as rituals. Many of the characters are typological. They're structured around memory systems or literary patterns that draw from memory systems. They are constructed from analogical roots or mimetic sources, other sources, and there's historical information in it as well, right? But this is sort of the matrix by which we get the Bible, and you simply can't just sit down and say, well, God said it, and therefore this is what happened. So that's just that's the deal. So just to recap, and then we can rabbit trail off whatever you want. But to summarize, I'm making some pretty important points. One, myth can contain historical content. Okay, so just because something is myth doesn't mean it doesn't draw from an actual person who's been mythologized or an actual event who's been mythologized. But whatever history is in myth, it doesn't long last the processes of mythologizing. And so the data gets turned into what can be remembered. The historical content is synthesized with cosmological and ritual patterns. So like Ramses II, the history is analogized with the journey of the sun through the underworld, where this is his source of power by which he defeats the Hittites. So the story as told on the temple isn't history, it's transhistory. It's ultimate reality. How did Ramses win? Well, he won because he is the initiate who knows the secrets of Ammon and can walk with the powers of the sun and has power over the enemies of the Egyptians. So this is the central core system of our belief. It's what holds our society together. So this is how we're going to tell the story. Okay. So now the question comes, and you already mentioned Troy. For a long time, people didn't believe Troy actually existed. Well, if you read the source material of Troy, there's still a lot of speculation, by the way. I'm not so sure the city they picked as Troy is actually Troy. But what I can say is I think most of the characters of Homer's Iliad were historical characters. The story being told by Homer isn't a biography of them. It's all mythologized, but the Greeks did fight the Trojans. And so, which city and where and how it happened, well, we don't know the blow-by-blow account. But what about Gilgamesh, right? We have this whole epic of Gilgamesh. That whole epic is mythology, and yet he's found on ancient kings lists. And so if you ask, Near Eastern scholars, is Gilgamesh a historical person? A lot of them will say, well, probably, because he's on the kings list. And they put historical people on those kings lists. Now, the problem with the kings list is they're also mythologized, right? Some of the kings live for thousands of years. It's like the patriarchs in the Bible who live for centuries, right? The Near Eastern kings lists share the same patterns of that. And so even though the kings list themselves are being mythologized, but most people recognize, yeah, they're probably still historical people. And so Gilgamesh might be an actual person, but you can't prove it. You can't disprove it. You can't pull that needle out of the haystack. We just don't have enough information, right? King Arthur is another example. Yeah, most scholars will say, no, he's not a real person in history. But you got this tight-knit group of scholars who are good scholars who say, no, we believe he was a real person in history, right? And if you read the, romantic tales of the Knights of King Arthur, those tales have all been mythologized. And guess what? Jessie Weston writes this great book in 1920, From Ritual to Romance, where she talks about the rudiment storyline of the romantic stories of King Arthur's knights comes from the Greco-Roman mystery traditions. Comes from those same as Jesus, right? Comes from those religious initiations, because the knights will undergo many of the same initiatory perils and problems that the initiates did of those religions. And so it's a fascinating book. But the bottom line is King Arthur real? And again, I don't have a pony in the fight. All I can say is I've read scholars on both sides, and some scholars insist he's not real, and some scholars insist that he is. We just don't have enough information. The whole point, though, is that just because something is myth does not mean it's not historical. And very often there's historical seeds all through it. But you can't read it as real blow by blow history, right? It's not a modern history. It's mythologized. Fully sourced historical methodology is a modern invention. So I went over how even medieval monks treated texts. They copied one biography into another. They thought that was a legitimate thing to do. And so the way we look at history is really only a couple centuries old. You know, Herodotus is trying to record history. There are Greek historians who are trying to record what actually happened. But to get a fully sourced methodology of modern history making is a modern invention. Okay, so that's not happening when the Gospels are written. People rarely fabricate history. They do rewrite it all the time. Okay, so this is another problem I have with mythicism. Is it seems to me, and you can inform me what Richard Carrier believes, but that people are just fabricating Jesus. People rarely just make up stuff, and oral peoples don't. To mythologize a thing is to tell the essence of a thing. So again, using the example of Ramses, they're telling you the essence of the historical narrative by using the religious mythology. That's what they're doing. And so
I just might as well plug what I've picked up so far. I don't want to stop too far, just to give you an idea. I think he takes more of an angelology approach. So it's not that he's completely fabricated and just fictionalized completely, that Jesus is actually an angelic figure in this narrative. So he never was an actual man. The idea of him being an angel who comes down to earth in the narrative, he's a form of an angel, so to speak, who becomes son of man. You should really check out his book. I'd love to hear your criticisms too, because I know you'll have some, but
all right.
Yeah.
Email me the book I need to read and I'll read it.
Okay.
Okay. Anyway, the point is people rarely fabricate history, but very often the histories we get are rewritten. And this happens even in modern times. Even modern histories eventually turn into ideological and archetypal tales. And I briefly mentioned, just the 20th century regimes who rewrote their histories, but it happens in my own lifetime. When I went to elementary and high school, the American founding fathers were demigods. When I got to college, they were all evil old white men who owned slaves, right? The narrative had completely changed. And I thought, well, no, wait a second, stop. Which is it, right? Are they demigods, or are they wicked, evil old white men with slaves? And, so you can, but the bottom line is people are arguing over the archetypes in the history making all the time, right? And so what's really interesting is sometimes history gives us both, right? Can a person be not a very good person and end up doing demigod kind of things? Well, sometimes history gives you that. Oh crap, So but the bottom line is history is difficult to construct, and every history is sort of an invention of the historian. And so the point with modern history is you try to source it as thoroughly, because all your approaches are interpretations of the sources, and you have to admit that. And there are a lot of historians who don't, so and they're just bad historians. And this is happening today. This picture, by the way, is Glastonbury. It's the mythical resting place of King Arthur. That's why I put it in here. Did King Arthur really get buried in Glastonbury? Did Joseph of Arimathea? That's another tradition around Glastonbury, that Joseph of Arimathea came and taught Christianity. Well, see, these are all fables, probably with no historical content, but So now we take all this, and I just thought we would go over some arguments. Was Jesus historical? Do we have time for this, or are we done?
No, go for it. I'm very open to hearing. I love learning and listening to this stuff.
Well, I'm not going to say yes or no. What I'm going to say is, in the ancient world, myth is seen as what is ultimately real, an oral epistemology that sought to describe truth and reality. So what it's not is fabrication. What it's not is fantasy. What it's not is fiction. Ancient myth was truth and reality. We just do not think this way. This way of thinking is, when we write a historical narrative, we do not write it the way the Egyptians wrote Ramses defeating the Hittites. Okay? But in oral societies, history is retained that way. By the way, there's a really interesting story in the Bible, the Old Testament, that matches the narrative structure of the Temple of Karnak, the narrative of King Ramses, almost blow for blow. Really interesting.
Really?
And what story? Yes. And what story is that? The story of the founding of Israel, the story of Jacob. Now, what happens with Jacob? He steals the birthright from his brother, but then he goes to Laban, his father-in-law, and he lives there for 20 years or 7 years or whatever, 3 7-year periods. He marries 2 women, right? The Laban tricks him into marrying both his daughters. And then he goes back to his people, but he's stolen the birthright from Esau. And he's afraid that Esau is going to kill him for good reason, right? And so he goes back into his land, and he comes to the ford of Jabbok, which is it's a play on the name Jacob. But it's this river, and in all these underworld mythologies, the Book of the Dead, the darkest hour of the night, you come to this impassable sea, right? That you have to cross in order to reascend out of the underworld. So Jacob comes to a river. It's the darkest hour of the night. He says a prayer to Yahweh. An angel shows up. He wrestles all night. And at the rising of the sun, he overcomes his interlocutor, sees the face of God, and is given a new name. Okay, so it is a remarkable parallel. Ramses faces the Hittites. He descends with the sun, says his prayer at the darkest hour of the night, at the ford of the underworld, reascends with the sun to conquer the Hittites. Jacob does the exact same thing. It's the exact same historical structure, or the narrative structure. And so what's going on there? Well, in my view, what's going on there is what the Egyptians did with Ramses is what the Israelites did with Jacob. The Egyptians analogized Ramses with the center of their cult, the Book of the Dead, which they didn't call the Book of the Dead. They called it the Book of Life. But the mythology and the ethos of the underworld journey that gives one power to rise and conquer the enemies of the world. That's probably what's happening with Jacob. What we're witnessing is a narrative structure that is analogizing the ritual structure of the temple cult, that the high priest literally went through some sort of underworld descent, got to the Holy of Holies, the veil, parted the veil, rose with the sun, saw the face of God, sat on the throne. This is a sort of priestly initiatory initiation that gets put into a mythological narrative that makes it into our story of Jacob. I would argue this is what's happening with the Exodus and Moses, and this is what is happening. So all your creation stories and your founding stories are your top candidates for the mythologies of the oral tradition, because those are the stories that oral societies hold the most sacred. So they're going to be retained. So your creation stories, so your early stories of Genesis are going to come from that oral cultic tradition. But then your founding stories, the founding of Israel, is also going to come from that tradition. And we get 3 of those stories in the Old Testament. You get Jacob, who is Israel. He's renamed Israel. You get Moses in the Exodus. And you get this really interesting story of the talking donkey, Balaam, and that he is the foreign soothsayer that King Balak hires to curse Israel as they're coming in to found their society in his land, right? And that whole narrative is actually a repetition, in my view, of the priesthood cult narrative that you get echoes of in the story of Jacob, you get echoes of in the story of Exodus. And that's because they're similar kinds of founding narratives. And so, so there you have it. You have these really interesting parallels and narrative structures that definitely come from the oral tradition. And if they come from the oral tradition, they're going to be coming from a ritual cosmological temple cult. And so this sort of thing is going to bleed into the narrative. Are you following that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the whole ritualistic approach is interesting, especially when you look at stuff like Genesis 1. A lot of people are wrestling with this. Is this ex nihilo? No. But is it purely temple? Here's my question. I guess this is why I think it's important to ask this. There are people who are researching this that will say Genesis 1 is purely the setup of temple. For example, like Margaret Barker's type of work where she is describing temple language. We know it's temple language. It's obvious. But is not the world or the actual creation also a temple, so to speak? It's temple language, and the temple that they worship in is a microcosm of the macrocosm of the actual world we live in.
That's correct.
Oh, so you agree that that would be like the creation account is macro, micro in one?
That's correct. I agree. Look, they have a completely different cosmology. So the, again, this is another show. The mythological Earth is, if you read books on ancient Israel cosmology, they say the Earth was sort of this sphere where there were mountains around the perimeter that held up the sky, and then there was the sky, and then God lived above the sky, and so they have this really simplistic disc-like idea of how the universe was made and how the world was made. That's modern scholarship. This is what they're saying. We think this is how the ancient Israelites conceived of the world. I flatly disagree with it. You look at oral societies, the mythological Earth is almost always an integration of the horizon with the sky. The mountains are almost always constellations that hold up the sky. And so, you get the three tiers of the ancient world: the heaven above, the heaven below, and the heaven in between, which is the material realm, the earth. And all of that is sort of this astrocosmological structure that they see with observational astronomy. The circumpolar stars in the north is the heaven above, the stars below the celestial equator is the heaven below, and the earth between isn't the material disk you're standing on. It's that plus the stars up to the ecliptic. And so it is a celestial zone. And so the bottom line is they are conceptualizing things radically different than we are. And so the creation text is a story about the creation of the world, but it's not patterned off modern ideas of creation and science. It's patterned off ideas of your annual agricultural cycle and the power of the sun and stars and moon, which give power to that agricultural cycle. And you're politicizing it because your priest is your king. And so, there's all these layers that are a part of it that that constitutes the creation story. All of that's dropped in Genesis 1 and 2.
I gotta ask you, is it wrong of me, and I'm not a bully at all, but is it wrong of me to poke at that? I used to think 7,000-year-old Earth, literal ex nihilo, do you find it wrong of me to poke fun at that whole idea, the way that people mistreat an ancient text like this? I do it, and I don't mean it in a derogatory, but it might come across that way on this show. I poke at stuff like this. Guys who think donkeys really literally talk. Snake, because I was that guy. I did not understand.
Derek, that's the way I was taught it. Right? So growing up as a kid, that's how I believed it. Right. It was all literal and it was all real, and the earth was 7,000 years old. I wasn't old enough to start asking questions of, where do the dinosaurs come from? And they have answers for that, by the way.
Oh, they got, dude, I don't even want to start right now. There's some really clever ones.
Go ahead, poke it. Look,
No, I think we're doing a service here, John. That's the ultimate thing is I poke it, but I also want to give something. It's not just poke. Here's a solution to your problem. And we're doing it right now with what you're doing. First of all, is groundbreaking. I love the orality concept. I never hear anyone really, I hear people talk oral tradition this, oral tradition that. They literally say it as a passing phrase. They never really take the time. Now, don't get me wrong. I get probably why. I mean, can they really say what they know is the oral traditions? Maybe not all of it.
No.
You're trying to take literary structures and say, we can glean and find evidences, I guess you'd say, half a fingerprint in it that tells us there's some dancing, there's some music, there is some orality in this, and they were transitioning. And that's something I find beautiful with what you do.
I mean, it's, look, I can't prove that the story of Jacob is a analogized story that derives from the ancient cosmological temple cult. I believe that's what it is, but I can't prove it. But if you look, biblical studies treats the oral, that they're now very serious about the oral tradition, right? That's a development in the last 20, 30 years.
Yep.
They're now very serious about it. Having said that, they still treat the oral tradition like it's a literate one. Right. So they go in and they say, well, how did they memorize and how did they repeat the memories and how did they perform the memories? And what I'm saying is, stop. It's not just about memorization of a text. It's not a text at all. It's a completely different epistemology. It's a completely different way to organize knowledge. And it's ritual, it's a myth, it's cosmology, it's sacred space, and it's all organized around your agricultural cycle, what you need to do to live, right? And so it's a completely different way to conceive of things. And as a result, large portions of it, we can't reconstitute. I mean, it's lost. So no one can do it.
You said it before, and I thought it was interesting. God spoke and said.
Right.
And so orality, we go back to that. It's not just that this is a term being used by you. You're suggesting in a literal sense, something oral is what was really the depths of the deepest you can get in these spoken rituals, not just written. And they probably were afraid the same way you would see people, I guess this is a bad analogy, but the way they jot out the name God, they don't even want to speak it.
That's correct. That's
correct. You got to imagine how sacred some of these teachings were. And Jesus said, I thank you, Father, that you have not revealed these things. So yeah, I used to, as a literalist, go, why would our Lord ever hide something from, you know what I mean? Like, I didn't understand what's going on here. So I'm seeing there could be something in those passages.
Yeah, I agree.
But if you don't mind, was Jesus historical? I want to throw something out there because, I love wrestling this topic. And I wanted to say, it could all be myth and still have history there. There still could be historical characters, and the whole thing could be what I call fictional. I don't mean it like completely hocus pocus, but meaning it didn't literally historically happen. And there might be stuff that, like you said, mimesis, what we're reading with Dennis R. MacDonald, that's borrowed from, Homeric epic, or the Bacchae with Dionysus, or whatever it might be. I'm looking at this narrative and I see things like, what can we know about Jesus with certainty? And a lot of people go, he was crucified. Okay, because it was a common used tool, obviously for insurrection. The Romans killed Jews often in the first century utilizing this tool. Jesus is claimed by his followers to have been crucified. He died, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a good case to be made. What gets me in the depths here, and I'm not denying that, what gets me in the depths here is how complex the authors must have been to use such mimetic tools in the way they did. They were one of the most brilliant writings you can read, because they're not only borrowing from, in my opinion, these books of Odysseus and his journeys with the Homeric epics and the Bacchae and all these Greek poetic stories. They're taking from Old Testament and they're doing funny things with it, like the serpent that was lifted in the wilderness. Well, for crying out loud, crucifixions, if you were to take the crucifixion as a lifting up, and Jesus goes into the wilderness. Where's the wilderness? Jerusalem. And it just, to me, it's like if there was a guy and he was crucified, as it seems, if you're going to take a historical approach here in any way, they took an idea of lifting one up in the wilderness and were capable of utilizing that into a story where the serpent or the curse, I guess, depending on how you want to look at it in the New Testament narrative. I don't know what you would interpret the serpent in the New Testament. That might be the wise one, because a serpent was wise. I don't know. I'm not an interpreter here that knows this. I'm interested in interpretations, but he's lifted up in the wilderness. And in order to get to the new, the land flowing with milk and honey that Israel had to go to, which is the idea the New Testament is giving, you had to pass through and get bit by the snake. In a sense, you have to be through go through this thing, and that would be Jesus Christ. So I see so much of the theology. I see so much myth. It's hard for me personally going, this is what he did. I'm a skeptic on if there was a guy who literally was crucified and that's really what this is based off of. I am open to the idea that many Jews were crucified. Israel was known to be crucified often by the Romans, Israelites, I mean. Did they use that as a template, or was there an actual guy? I don't know. It fascinates me. It's a good question. So hope that kind of gives you something. And that's just one. I mean, there's so many things and layers. It's hard.
Well, look, there's, the old saying, there's the Jesus of history, and then there's the Jesus of faith. And, the Christian message is a message, in my view, that is the moral faith message. Derek, I'm three things. I don't shy away from it. I'm a scholar. I'm a man of faith, and I'm a pluralist. And a pluralist is, I accept all faiths as long as they do good, right? Fundamentalism happens when you stop becoming a pluralist. And it's not just evangelical fundamentalists I'm talking about, right? When you cut out all the difference from other social, look what happened to Muslim culture. They carried science through the Middle Ages until they basically said that our way is the only way, and they stopped being pluralist societies. They stopped taking in Christians and people from other cities and countries, and they turned into it's a theocracy, a non-pluralist theocracy, and that destroys, and it destroys every time. And it's not only true for governments, it's true for religions, and it's not only true for religions, it's true for governments and cultures. And so whenever you get a subculture that becomes non-pluralist, it starts dumbing itself down, and it never knows that until it destroys itself. And just so people understand, it's easy to make fun of people who take the Bible completely literally and historically. I get it. It's really easy to make fun, and I sometimes I just find them. I don't make fun of them. They're just exhausting. I'm like, God, really? Can you just step out your front door for 5 minutes and just look? But having said that, it's not a structure of religion that does this. It's human nature that does this, right? The secular world does the exact same thing. Sorry, but you walk on some university campuses and they are becoming so non-pluralist. You have to have one ideology, and it's actually a little frightening. Some of the corners of our society, on the left and the right, on the religious and the non-religious, wherever this kind of fundamentalist non-pluralism occurs, it's problematic and dangerous. So, that's just my plug.
I actually agree with you on that.
That's my plug, that when it comes, I'm a Christian, and I certainly don't take the Bible literally, but I exercise faith in God as a way.
Technically,
As a
you'd be
way.
very liberal in your approach, though. I mean,
Yeah.
you're not, and that's fair. I mean, we've talked about this before. We were talking about the 3 days, death, burial, resurrection, and I talked about, could this be a ritual instead of a literal thing? And you're like, well, I believe it, but yes, Derek, it could be. And I'm like, wow, someone who's of faith could even say that. Tells me the open-mindedness that you have, even though you're not convinced of that. You have your beliefs, right? But that tells me that I respect that. You see what I'm saying? Where I'm coming from is there are people who are damning me. I don't even think your ideology has me or anyone going to technically a burning lake of fire type concept. But regardless, I'm not even worried about that, because there are people who damn me and curse me and tell me, because I don't buy I have very good reasons, John. If they were willing to just talk to me, I have very good reasons to say, my friend, I'm reading literature. I'm willing to say it's beautiful literature. I'm willing to say I'm glad we don't follow a lot of this stuff anymore, and that our culture has evolved and we have progressed. And I'm willing to talk these things out with you and tell you why I'm convinced this is another beautiful piece of literature, teaching wonderful things, but not literal, in my opinion. They can be taken as lessons, and they can have historical root. They could have, there's a variety of things, celestial science, if you will, to some degree. I mean, maybe it's not necessarily, but there could be celestial implications. And the last thing that I'm not convinced of is that a man swallowed by a giant fish, that a man really split a Red Sea, that, man made a woman from his rib, or God made a woman from Adam's rib. I don't buy that literally, and I have good reasons why I think that. And I wouldn't go to, and I'd hope they would follow me on this journey. Let's go check out the Egyptian myth. Actually, let's go check out the Epic of Gilgamesh. How much of your own methodology are you going to utilize? And that's what I love about you, John. You don't go to the Epic of Gilgamesh and paint a different picture as you would. Do you see what I mean? You're open-minded. Even if you follow a certain particular faith, you never push that, and you're open-minded to say, I'm looking at the Epic of Gilgamesh like I'm looking at Genesis. I'm looking at these things and going, guys, literature, beautiful literature, history, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I rabbit trailed, sorry.
No. I'm 100% with you. 100%. In my own personal theology, the only people who are damned are the Rosicrucians and the French. Just kidding.
You're terrible. You're terrible. Oh, man.
No, everyone else is making it to heaven.
Okay.
And maybe the Rosicrucians. No, I'm just kidding. Look, personally, God's a mystery to me, and that's the joy of the journey. And there's different ways to define God, but
right.
I think a person who lives a good and just life knows more about God than anyone else. So
you're getting esoteric on me there,
no,
John.
I'm not getting esoteric. I'm getting pragmatic.
I'm just saying,
like I said, there's bad religion in every religion. There are Christians who do Christianity horribly, and it creates so much suffering and evil. And there are Christians who do Christianity great, and it creates so much good. And, look, there are atheists who do atheism horrible, and there are atheists who do atheism great. This is the pluralist in me. I don't care what you are. I don't care if you're Jewish or Muslim or Hindu or atheist or agnostic. I just care that you're just and good, and that you carry a little wisdom with you to apply justice and goodness. And if that's what you do, I'm interested in you, and I'm interested in your faith. And I want to learn, let's sit down, break bread, learn from each other. That's me. And that's always been me. And so that kind of person doesn't stay with a 7,000-year history of the world long, because I'm like, I'm now 12 years old. I'm ready to move on. So
I thought we were done poking. I mean,
No.
just get it out, man. No, I'm just kidding. Please continue, sir.
I just to finish up here. Boy, we are rabbit trailing all over the place. You're going to have to edit this.
I really enjoy you. No, I think this is me and you heart to heart.
This is me and you heart to heart, buddy.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
No, and that's the best stuff as
Yes,
far as
sir.
I'm concerned. It's the best stuff. Listen, historicity and literality are not the same thing. Something can be historical, and you don't have to interpret the text you have as literal. Okay, something can be literal and not historical. Now, how's that possible? Well, again, that's very hard for our literate modern minds to wrap around. But look, 90% of the teachings of Jesus are parables. Is he teaching historical stories? Is the parable of the Good Samaritan a editorial from the Washington Post? No. So I was just making the point that historicity and literality are not necessarily the same thing. You can have history that you don't take literally. You can have a story you can take literally, but not historically. Okay.
Right.
And the Bible's full of that. And then you've already mentioned this, Derek, showing that narrative elements in the New Testament are not modern history does not disprove their historicity. If they're not historical as we define it, that doesn't mean that there isn't historical truth to it. And the other point is showing that narrative elements or structures are mythological does not disprove historicity. We've just went over that.
Mm-hmm.
That myth and history intertwine sometimes. There's a little bit of both sometimes in them. And so these are all issues that make defining a historical Jesus not just straightforward. You have the believers that say everything happened just as the Bible tells me, and you have some critics that say it's all mythological and not historical, and both those positions are just inaccurate, plain. And then I'm just my plug. Inventing a new religion without strong historical roots, deeply unlikely. There almost always there's a historical person or event around which an innovation of religion occurs. And when I say almost always, I can't think of an exception. Maybe there is, but there's a historical person or event that occurs around which a new ideology begins to percolate. So every religion you look at in history is surrounding something important that happened in history. And so again, I'm not a mythicist. I do believe there is a historical Jesus. The text we get isn't giving us, a literal historical account. But you can make your arguments. In the end, I can't, there's just, you don't get the sources you want from that era. So you can't prove or disprove a lot of the arguments that are being argued. You just can't do it. And I run into this all the time in my work because I deal with ancient mythology, where you reach the horizon of what you can know really quick, and after that you have to speculating. And scholar, sometimes I hate doing that. It's like I just can't say one way or the other. But if I had to guess, it would be this.
Right.
But I know as soon as I make that statement, there's going to be a dozen other scholars over here who are all sons of bitches who are going to say, no, you can't say this, and they'll try to destroy you. And that's what people do. But and so you really want to have a firm foundation, but a lot of these issues you don't get that, right? And so that's just the nature of. That's just the nature of the beast.
John, I don't think we need to rabbit trail into anything more. I think we touched on a lot. And first of all, I want to recommend everybody to get the book, because the perception that you are showing, it really does make a lot of sense. It's not too far off from what a lot of the scholars are saying, but you take an interesting route, unlike what I hear from other scholars. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. With the orality concepts, we can't think like them. And I think if you really want to have a grasp on what John's saying and a lot of this to really get roots in it, I think your book is extremely important to understanding that. And we've had long enough talks that I think I've gathered a lot of what you're saying, but I still need to dig deeper with you. And I think more episodes we can get for people who haven't got the book, who are interested in learning more on this. We can go into specific stories. We can go into other things in the future. I don't think, I'm going to keep my research on the historicity of Jesus, of course. I'm also looking for people on the historicity of Buddha. I want to get Buddhist scholars who are not just Buddhist monks, but like scholars and maybe religious in their group. Because Dr. Price told me that there's the same argument going on in the Buddhist
No,
circles.
absolutely.
And then Robert Spencer recently, I watched
Not
it.
to mention Muhammad.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, the Muslims.
I'm trying to find more cool, interesting things like that, different dynamics. You have friends in the scholarly world. I'd love to interview them. Your work, we haven't even, guys, we're on the Titanic and we just left the boatyard. Okay. We're not even near the tip of the iceberg. We got a long ways to go.
This journey ends with everyone dying.
Yeah.
We're on the Titanic.
That's a good point.
Get a different boat. Get a different boat.
Hey, at least you're not sinking into a lake of fire. Okay. So look, it's all ice. Okay. I heard Inferno in the Latin is where we got hell, and is actually a freezing place, not a hot place. Someone said something like that. I was like, what? This is weird. I really enjoyed this presentation. I learned a lot. There was a lot there that I've never thought about, and I really enjoyed your parallels to showing interesting things with the Book of the Dead. You said it was called the Book of Life.
Yes.
To them. Why do we call it the Book of the Dead?
Because it's buried with the dead. So the archaeologist said, here's a book, it's buried with all the dead, we'll call it Book of the Dead. But it's the book that taught them how to live, right? So it's literally the book of life for them.
Wow.
It was a way to live. And so
it makes me think of the biblical Tree of Life, Book of Life, names jotted in the Lamb's Book of Life, that kind of stuff. I don't know if there's some connection, but
yeah,
might be.
You know what? Look, Derek, if 10,000 years from now, if Christianity completely disappears and you have some future archaeologists dig up a old Christian church that somehow survives underneath the rubble, right? And he has no text, right? He might have a couple of pages of a Latin mass that he hasn't translated yet. And all he has is a broken altar above which is this guy who's nailed to a cross on the wall, right? How is he going to interpret that religion, right? He's going to say, well, these people worshiped a guy that they nailed to a cross and they were a death cult, right?
Right.
And so this is how we do it when we look at these ancient religions, such as, the Egyptian religion. No one really knows what is really going on, because we don't have, the majority of the context was oral, and that's disappeared. And so we like to think that, we've got a good handle on it. We've got these texts, we got the pyramid text, we got the Book of the Dead. But quite frankly, some of the most renowned Egyptologists will admit even the most basic things we do not understand when it comes to that world. And so, and that's just a fact. So
I see a lot of phallus. So when I see that, I start to wonder, and then of course, you got Horus, and then you got Osiris, and Osiris is missing his, we'll talk about this one later, man.
There's a lot of phallic imagery.
But that goes all over the place, all these different places. John, thank you so much. How can people get a hold of you? Or do you give that information out?
I put out a website, johnlundwall.com. But then a couple months ago it got hacked, and I haven't put it back up yet. So
that's crazy.
And who's hacking it? Who am I?
Yeah, like what are they trying to do? I don't understand.
I have no idea. So here in the next month or two, that'll be back up, and you can see all my work, my archaeoastronomy work with Native American rock art. I have a series called Myth and the Bible on my website that we're just going over things that we've already talked about, such as on this show.
You know, I travel the world. All the pictures on that slideshow tonight I've taken. So all those pictures, I travel the world to different sacred sites, studying them, learning them, sometimes taking tours to them. And so when that gets back up, great. If not, look me up on Facebook, ping me. I don't bite. Well, I'll have to look at the comments on this. We'll see how, maybe you want to invite me back, but
Are you
there you have
kidding
it.
me? Anyone who I don't, that's not how we roll here at Myth Vision. If they're too bad, I'll just silence them. That's, they won't have any say in the
Oh,
comments.
no, don't silence them. I
Depends.
like reading those.
Yeah, there's certain ones though.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's true. That's true. There's some that you have to say, okay.
Yeah, okay, look, Satan, shut up. No, I'm just kidding with you. But no, I really appreciate that. Guys, go down to the description. You guys see the Amazon affiliate link. You can get the book there. I think it gives us like change on the dollar for purchasing a book through the Amazon affiliate link. Or you can go to his website when that is up and running. But definitely check that out and be on the lookout because we're going to have him back on the show. I want to talk about some of the rock stuff that I think is hidden. It's secret. Somewhere it's lost.
I got a great.
There was a recording that we had, if you've made it this far, you deserve to know. So I just want to say, we did a 3-hour recording, and John decided to take the hitman off that was going to come after me. But we did a 3-hour recording, and I had to reboot my computer. I lost all of the recording, and I was disappointed to even mention it to him. And he actually was kind enough to come back on the show. He talked to God about me not going to hell and stuff like that. We're good now. So
Wait, you're not a Rosicerian, are you?
No.
Okay, well then you're good.
I'm good. Okay. No, but seriously, let us know if you want to hear something from him. And if you have any questions, message me. I have direct contact with him. I could try and find out for you, or we could set up a show and we'll try to answer your question particularly. So
great.
John, you got a great setup there. Really appreciate you joining me again. And any last word?
Oh, keep the faith, buddy. Right, whatever that is, do good and be just, and love your show. You keep it up. Keep up the good work. Keep it open-minded. That's the way I do it, and it seems to be the way you do it. I enjoy it. So I keep it up.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I will do that. And ladies and gentlemen, we are Myth Vision.